Have you ever been to a doctor who has written up a prescription for pleasure to help you heal whatever is ailing you? Well, my guest today has developed a revolutionary set of pleasure prescriptions to help you heal sexual pain. Curious to learn more? Make yourself comfortable and listen in. Welcome to Pleasure in the Pause, a podcast dedicated to inspiring midlife women to feel more connected to their bodies, pleasure, and power through perimenopause, menopause, and beyond. I am your host, Gabriella Espinosa, midlife and sexual wellness coach, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. Dr. Dee Hartmann is a pioneer in the field of physical therapy and pelvic health. She has over 30 years' experience helping patients decrease pelvic pain, restore health, and reclaim their pleasure. She has co-authored the book, The Pleasure Prescription, a surprising approach to healing sexual pain, written to help women find a path from pain to pleasure. In our conversation, we talk about some of the most common issues that lead to pain during sex and how her set of pleasure prescriptions is helping thousands of women to heal and experience more pleasure. Welcome, Dee. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here with you, to chat with you. Thank you.
I'm so excited about our conversation. I have been hearing a lot in the last few years about how pelvic floor physical therapists are the gold standard of pelvic floor care. And just last week on the podcast, I had a wonderful conversation with Kim Vopni, who's a fitness trainer and pelvic floor educator known as the Vagina Coach, who spoke to us about the structure and function of the pelvic floor and connected the dots for us between pelvic floor and vulvovaginal health. Mm-hmm. And she also strongly advocates for women seeing pelvic floor PTs as the first line of defense when experiencing any pelvic floor or vulvovaginal pain, but also to get a baseline of where you are in terms of your pelvic floor health, a pelvic floor health checkup of sorts, especially in midlife, something I've yet to do. So when I heard our mutual friend, Dr. Samina Rahman, who has also been on the show, talk about you, I said, this is a pelvic floor physical therapist I want to speak to. And you are not only a pelvic floor PT, but a doctor of physical therapy with a 30-year track record of helping patients decrease pelvic and sexual pain and restore their health and vitality using a unique functional approach, which includes the prescription of pleasure, which is what we are all about here on Pleasure in the Pause. So thank you so much for your incredible expertise and body of work.
Thank you.
I'd love to start by asking you how you landed in this particular field of healing sexual pain through the lens of pleasure.
You know, that's one of the biggest questions people ask most often. What made you do this kind of thing? Because I started a very long time ago, as you said. In encapsulated story, my husband and I had 5 kids in just under 6 years.
Wow.
Okay. The first one was delivered by C-section. The second one was a forceps delivery. The third was I had 4th degree tearing because I delivered vaginally after the first one. 4th degree tearing, went on to have the 4th and 5th and actually walk from my room after the 5th one was born. Mm-hmm. But when I decided to go back to work, I decided I wanted to do it in women's fitness and women's health because I felt like I had learned so much. I was only the second women's health physical therapist in the Chicago metro area, so people thought I was really, really, really weird. Not long after I opened my office, I had a woman come through the door in tears saying, I've had 2 vulvar surgeries. I still can't sit without pain. Can you help me? And I said, well, I don't know. Let's see what's going on. I did a physical exam, and it was like her pelvic floor on the left side had been tacked to her ischial tuberosity. Mm-hmm. Obviously, she had pain when she sat because of that stretch. So we worked on it, and that's where we got. And that was really my first vulvar pain patient that really hooked me. I went to our national physical therapy meeting, and there was a newsletter from the National Vulvodynia Association. And in it was an article by Dr. Howard Glazer, who's a psychologist in New York City, was doing work with surface EMG. And he's really the one who told us and educated us on the impact of overactive pelvic floor activity in women with chronic vulvar pain. So went and spent several days with him. And from that, it was just no looking back. And I always considered it an incredible honor that women would come in and share with me truly the most intimate of details of their lives, because it's not easy to talk about having sexual pain.
And how did you become so comfortable talking about sex and pleasure?
It's really quite interesting. I talked about sex the first time on our national stage at one of our meetings in 1997. So I've been talking about sex for a very long time. It
Mm,
was something that made sense to me. You can't deal with a woman who has vulvar pain and not deal with sex. It's a
mm,
huge part of it. Now, that being said, I've had a struggle forever talking with physicians. Well, we can get rid of the pain. We can get rid of that, in a number of ways. What difference does it make? And then they can just do what they can do. They can go ahead and have sex, but we know that, in fact, that doesn't happen. That when we get rid of the pain, it isn't enough. That we have to help them really figure out what to do because they really, most of the time, don't have any idea. And pleasure is a piece of that. Pleasure
mm.
is not just sexual pleasure. We have to start with sensual pleasure. We have to be happy. We have to feel good inside and out before we can really be there sexually. I mean, we get so busy and so confounded with so many things, we don't really think about that basic level of endorphins that make us feel good. And pleasure
Mm.
in your life increases that.
You are speaking my language, Dee. And we're going to speak about more about your bespoke pleasure prescriptions. I want to just dial it back a little bit. I'll speak for myself. I think a lot of us forget about our pelvic floors in midlife because we associate them with pregnancy and doing Kegels before we give birth. And then something can go wrong. Either we experience pain, discomfort during sex, or embarrassing symptoms such as incontinence. And we don't know who to go to because we don't know enough about the pelvic floor. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And we certainly don't hear. I mean, it's only recently that I started hearing about the gold mine of support and treatment that pelvic floor PTs offer. I know women in France are offered by the national healthcare system 10 to 12 weeks of pelvic floor PT postpartum. And I don't think here in the US we take good care of women postpartum. And so possibly the main reason we start to experience these symptoms in midlife is because of earlier ruptures. So like the guests on my show, I want to advocate everyone go see a pelvic floor therapist just to get a baseline, just to get a sense of where you are. Can you talk us through what happens in a consultation with a pelvic floor PT if you've never been to one?
And I just have to say up front that not unlike doctors, lawyers, plumbers, everybody else, women's health physical therapists don't all do the same thing. And
Mm,
that's fine because not everybody works for everybody and not everybody finds things that others don't. So that being said, that's very important for people to hear. The basic history is key. And because we're physical therapists, we can deal with all symptoms. We're not gynecologists who can only deal with the reproductive tract. We're not urologists who can only deal with the urogenital tract or gastroenterologists. We deal with the whole body and we can look at function across the board, which really is one of the key things I think that makes what we do so valuable because we can address all of those areas. So going through a really detailed history is really important to give a sense of how you got here. Everybody gets here in a different way, and we just need to know not just what's going on right now, but what's happened in your life. In my practice, what I did once I did that and got through that history, you see my models on the back behind me on my top
mhm,
bookcase. It was very important for me to educate my patients what the pelvis and the muscles inside the pelvis look like. Because once you do that, you attach something physical for them to understand and to see. Because if you just talk about what's inside the pelvis, well, who knows?
yeah.
Who knows what? I mean, that deep, dark hole, I don't really even want to know what's in there. As long as it works, it's fine. I don't want to have to deal with it. I don't want to have to look at it. I don't have to think about it. But when there's a problem, you need to give women a physical sense of what's going on in that muscle structure. So we go through a real detailed anatomy. I'll then get them on my table, I'll do a physical exam, and I'll see what's happening. And again, from my perspective, and certainly treating pain is more detailed, but if someone were to come to me with incontinence, I'm very interested to know what's happening in the pelvic floor. Where does the pelvic floor sit at rest? How can it contract and relax? How can it do a fast contraction? How can it do a slow, sustained contraction? Where does it go? What does it do? Is there any prolapse? Can we see that the bladder and the urethra are losing a little bit of their support, or the rectum is losing a little support, or the uterus is falling down? All of that matters in what we're looking at, because that's going to impact the kind of exercises that we're going to do. After that really detailed examination, we create a treatment plan for them to use. And that varies. I mean, it includes pelvic floor exercises, but it certainly varies because we have to deal with bladder function, bowel function. So yeah, it all is very.
And it does include a physical examination, right? I think that was something I didn't know, that you're actually going to have someone go in and insert their fingers and palpate and do a little kind of feeling around to see the state of your pelvic floor. Is that right?
Well, that's certainly the case, but certainly isn't without consent. Before a lot of explanation, a lot of description, and again, consenting to do that. There's some women who won't want to do that, and that's appreciated by women's health physical therapists, and they understand. Again, we can go back to the model and help them understand what's going on. But our best bet is to really get a sense of what's happening in there, is to do a digital examination so we can see what's happening with the tissue. But it's not,
Hmm.
absolutely not. I mean, we're doing a lot of telehealth these days with great success, and there's certainly no digital assessment there. So we know things, they are changing as we go down the road. So yeah.
And then would you then in these telehealth appointments show women how to do this digital assessment on themselves?
We certainly can, and that can be a part of it. I don't do telehealth myself, but that certainly can be a big piece of it. And it's as simple as inserting a finger and squeezing in like you're trying to hold back gas and air, and see if your finger's being pulled up into your vaginal canal. And then when you let go, see that it comes down. You can also do it with a mirror. If you have a mirror and you're laying in bed with your knees up, and you squeeze in again like you're holding gas or pee, and you let go, you should see the area in between your vagina and your rectum. It's the perineal body. When you squeeze in, that perineal body should move up towards your head. And when you let go, it should come back down.
Hmm.
So you can physically see that motion, as well as, sorry, I palpate with my middle finger. I need to be better when I'm doing these things. But you can actually see and feel it both if you want to do that.
That's so helpful. Thank you for that visual and those instructions. I've talked a lot on the show about how women have come to normalize suffering and resign themselves to the myth that sex has to be painful as they move into menopause. I've heard a statistic that women often wait 6.5 to 7 years to seek treatment for sexual pain. When they do, they can see anywhere from 5 to 10 doctors before they get the help they need. So I feel women just accept this myth that painful sex is just part of going through menopause. So I imagine by the time women do find you, they are really in a lot of pain and are suffering. Could you share with us what are the main reasons and conditions that women come to see you for?
So in my practice, and again, because I was very early in the world of women's health, and because of my experience with having the woman with chronic vulvar pain come to me, that really became my trajectory. In the state of Illinois at the time, and across most of the United States, the only way we as physical therapists could see patients was if they were referred by a physician. So there was a physician or two in the Chicago metro area who found out that I was seeing these women and started sending these patients to me. At first saying to them, well, there's nothing else I can do for you. There's this physical therapist. I don't know what she's doing, but if she can't help you, I don't know what else to do, and would send them my way. So it was really quite interesting. Primarily, these were women who were diagnosed with some form of vulvodynia. That was either vulvar pain that's caused by touch at the opening or around the entire perineum. It can be localized right there, or it can be generalized and all around. So that was the patient population that I began seeing. And as a result of that, that really was my focus throughout the course of my practice. I certainly saw women in menopause, and I saw women postpartum after they'd had a baby with vulvar pain. But the vast majority of my patients were those with vulvodynia, typically now what we call localized provoked vestibulodynia, which is where your statistics are from. We know up to 16% of women in the United States have chronic vulvar pain for more than 3 months. It's amazing. I can tell you that it's been an incredible journey for me watching the medical community come through this. They're getting better, yet at the same time, there's still so far to go to help physicians understand that just telling a woman to relax,
Mm.
glass of wine, or here, better yet, here, and this I'll get kickback from people in the United States. Here's some lidocaine. Use lidocaine and you can have sex. You wanna have any pleasure with it, you'll have to get your pleasure elsewhere. Go ahead and have sex. We won't talk about what you're gonna feel like after that lidocaine wears off, but obviously you see I'm not a fan. But lots of
Mm.
people do that. So it really is a very complex issue, and again, that's kind of where I have grown up, is treating women with varying types of vulvodynia.
And going back to the examination, whether we're seeing a pelvic floor PT or we're kind of having a feel around for ourselves, what are you looking for in terms of that vulvar pain?
Right. Again, when I do a history, I go all the way back to their birth year, way
Mm.
back, because all of it, typically there are things that have happened in life that could be contributory. Women often think, what did I do to deserve this? What did I do wrong? So it was always my thought that if I could kind of come up, we can't prove anything, but if there was something that happened, if they had recurrent urinary tract infections as a child, or when they were a baby, their urethra was continually dilated because they weren't voiding, or they had a horrible they fell off their bike when they're in 3rd grade and could hardly walk for several days.
Mm.
All of those things have a tendency to lead up to something. We don't know that that's a positive thing or not, but at least it leaves women with an idea that, geez, maybe it's not just me. In the world of vulvodynia, we have primary vulvodynia, which happens the first time you try to touch your vulva, and secondary vulvodynia, which is you have pain-free sex and then you start having pain. So when they come to me, whichever the case, if it's localized provoked vestibulodynia, if it's secondary or primary, I go through that history, I go through my education, I get them on my table, and I do what I can. I've actually found 5 exercises that women can do prior to any type of vaginal exam that really seems to lessen that pain that's typically just right at the outside, right on the outside of the vulva. So I will do that and have them, palpate and see what their pain is. Go have them go through these exercises. And 9 times out of 10, not every time because nothing's 100%, but 9 out of 10 times that palpated vulvar pain at the opening decreases. So
Mm.
that begins, from my perspective, that begins to give, I feel that that is one way that I can begin to help women realize that they're not just crazy, that that's not all just in their head, that they didn't do something to make this happen, but that there are things that they can do to make it better. And that really is one of the most important things too that I talk about now when I do talk. There were very few women who I came to my office who, if I got them on my table, some on the first visit, we would talk for an hour and didn't have time for that. But if they were on my table, there were very few women in my office who complained of sexual pain who I was not able to do an internal exam on their first visit. This is, from what I hear, very different from other physical therapists, but that's okay because we all do things differently. And I do what I did because I was successful with it. So my goal really was to get inside and see, from my perspective, I think that chronic vulvar pain comes from issues in the bladder and the urethra, in the uterus, in the bowel, in the structures in and around the hips. It's a very multifaceted problem that causes that pelvic floor muscle tension that goes along with that pain at the outside.
I love that you take this really investigative approach, looking for the source of that pain instead of just, giving us a lidocaine or telling us to go away and drink a glass of wine. So you're talking about the physiological causes of these conditions. Are there other causes that can potentially lead to this condition?
You better believe it. Again, in the history of my looking at these women, and I've asked PTs, and I just came from a lovely trip to Australia, and they agreed with me in Australia, and I think they agree pretty much around the world, is that women who come to us with primary vestibulodynia, that is, they tried to use a tampon and they have pain and they couldn't get it in when they first tried, or they tried to touch their vulva and it hurt, or their first sexual experience was painful. I find
Mm.
that those gals traditionally, not 100% again, but traditionally were incredibly anxious. For what reason? Who knows? Were they born to an anxious mother who raised an anxious daughter who said, well, I had that problem, so you will too, kind of thing? Is it something that happened somewhere in their life cycle? We never really know, but it's my perspective now, even as I look back on these gals, is that there was trauma somewhere in their life.
Mhm.
And we know from the study of trauma that that trauma can live anywhere. It's not just in your brain, it can live anywhere in your body. And to be clear, again, my thinking is that if you have had sexual pain for more than 3 months or sexual pain at any point in your life, whether it was a wanted sexual activity and you had pain, whether it was a rape, whether it was a forced sexual whatever the case may be, if there's pain, that's trauma producing. And we really need to take a closer look at how we can get into that trauma response and make it better. If we can help make it better. We're not trauma therapists, and I'm not beginning to suggest that physical therapists are trauma therapists, but we spend a tremendous amount of time with these people. They tell us more than they ever tell anybody else. We gain their trust it was, again, such an honor to be there because of this. So it really is incumbent on us to really have that sense of what's going on and seeing how we can help. If it's referral to a trauma therapist, I'm okay with that too, as
Mhm.
long as we recognize it and help them realize that, again, they're not just crazy and this isn't all in their head.
Yeah, no, I've been in group spaces, group containers where women have shared stories of sexual trauma. And yeah, it's a very vulnerable and very tender terrain to cross, to come to deal with that trauma that our body's holding and to notice the different expressions of it, whether it's in our, outward, how we interact with other people, our sexual expression, our limiting beliefs. And I'm so grateful that there are pelvic floor PTs who are aware, who look at treatment through this lens and make referrals for that. I also know that I've heard stories from other women about gynecological and birth trauma,
Mm,
something that I don't think gets talked about enough.
I agree, 100%.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that postpartum period, right? If you're in midlife, I know all these things that we're talking about, which I realize are across the lifespan. So it's not only midlife women who are experiencing this, women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, older women are experiencing this. And it's because of this pain, this stronghold of emotions that our bodies is holding for us. And we may have just overlooked, right, what some of that birth trauma that we've experienced, or we may have overlooked that uncomfortable visit to the doctor's office, and we just go about our lives and then think, it's not until after we leave the doctor's office and think like, wait a minute, that wasn't right. Do you have any advice for women who may be listening to this and reflect back and think, yeah, oh, I remember that visit to the doctor's office, or yeah, it was that experience in birth, or yeah, potentially even, that sexual encounter with someone that I really need to look into? Where do we start with exploring those types of trauma?
And I think that, again, as physical therapists across the board, do treat on a psychosocial basis. We are treating both physically and emotionally. But when it comes to really getting into the depth of trauma that you're talking about, we need a really good trauma therapist or a really good sex therapist who is aware and can deal with the traumatic aspects of it, because it needs to be a multidisciplinary approach, and that's shown out in the literature multiple times. And I think we can work together. That being said, it doesn't mean that the pain is all in your head. So many women will be told, well, you need to go to a sex therapist, or you need to go to a psychiatrist. And it's like, I appreciate that if you're going to talk to me about the cause, but don't try to tell me that I'm just crazy and are imagining this pain. And that happens, unfortunately, still a lot. So it's that multidisciplinary approach. And, when you talk about pain across the life cycle, and talked about vulvodynia, which is a diagnosable problem, which is just pain at the introitus with touch. That's the gold standard for diagnosing it. But really, the most prominent times that sexual pain happens without that diagnosis is postpartum. And in
Mhm.
particular, if women are nursing, because the estrogen levels go sky high during pregnancy, and once we deliver, they tank. So that basically, if you nurse, you have a menopausal pelvis,
Yeah.
okay? And then going into perimenopause, as your estrogen level starts to drop in perimenopause, the same thing begins to happen. The mucus production decreases. The tissue in the vaginal canal gets very frail and thin and susceptible to damage. That's the physical changes, let alone the psychological changes. Nobody ever talks about how much we're going to miss estrogen. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've had a few doctors on the podcast talk about the genitourinary syndrome of menopause. I know what happens to the pelvis and the vulva vaginal area as we lose estrogen. I know you're a big proponent of education. I'm sure you include this in your discussions with patients. Do you tell me how you've teamed up with sex therapists, trauma therapists? Who else do you team up with in terms of this decline in hormones? So I know that part of your work or part of the work of any pelvic floor PT is probably to do referrals. Who do you often refer to? Who are your key team players in addressing women's sexual health?
Now, to be clear, I closed my clinical practice in 2017. So I have not been in clinical practice since then. We are in the Midwest. I practiced in the Chicago metro area. And I will tell you, in case you don't know, that the Midwest is usually behind. I really can't believe I said that out loud on a podcast, but we know that from a medical perspective, oftentimes things take a little bit longer to filter into the Midwest. So hormone replacement therapy wasn't such a big deal in the Midwest, even leading up to where I was. It was beginning to get more prevalent before I closed my clinical practice, but there were several. Dr. Rahman was one physician in the Chicago metro area who would see women and do hormone replacement therapy. Not all gynecologists are on board with hormone replacement therapy. Be interested in sexual function, which it's just the way it is. I don't fault them for being that way. That's just where their practice is. So you really need to find a physician, and physical therapists traditionally in practice now are in very close communication with physicians, trading patients back and forth when hormone replacement is needed. And that can be oral or it can be local, or pellet. I mean, there are all sorts of ways to get that back into the system.
Yeah, what I'm hearing and oh, bells are ringing in my head. It's like, okay, we need a pelvic floor PT on our healthcare team, regardless, right? We need to have them just like we go for our annual checkups for our mammogram or pap smear or colonoscopy. We have to go to that pelvic floor PT and have them be part of our care team just to get that checkup and just to make sure all the dots are connecting. I want to turn to your book now, The Pleasure Prescription, which I have here, The Pleasure Prescription, A Surprising Approach to Healing Sexual Pain, which you co-wrote with
What?
Elizabeth Wood, who is, I think you told me she's a sexological body worker, sexer. She has all these beautiful specialties in sexuality. And I love that you start the book by stating, and I think you mentioned earlier, that a happy, well-pleasured, empowered woman will be in less pain and eventually they'll be able to make the world a better place. I'm so on board with that. So often when we think about pleasure, we think it's selfish or indulgent. There is so little we know about female pleasure. And often when we think about it, we think of it in terms of something taboo or sexual. And that I find is not very helpful if someone is feeling pain, disconnected, or numb, compounding the feeling that, there could be something wrong with me. So I love that you use pleasure as a prescription, as a starting point. And we'll talk about you have over 22 pleasure prescriptions. Many of them are non-sexual in nature. You have some wonderful anatomical drawings and illustrations so women can get to know their bodies. You talk about the different types of pain and how it works, and so many great case studies. I was fascinated by the case studies at the beginning of each chapter that come with a set of prescriptions that women can do on their own to follow up the treatment of the condition they're experiencing and help integrate into their treatment of whatever's causing their problem. And I'd love for you to start talking about why you took this lens of pleasure. Why was this necessary at this point in your career and in this point in your work?
It was truly a culmination. Elizabeth, my co-author, was a sex therapist. And that's where we met many years ago in a clinic in Chicago. And it really is a culmination. I came from the position of getting rid of the pain, and she really was the one who said, well, we need to go from here, because I think that even that I, as a physical therapist treating vulvar pain, didn't go far enough. I want to go back and see everybody I ever saw before and
Mm.
talk to them more about this. I always talked about sex. I always talked about having orgasm, what it's like, what you do, how to get there. I always talked about that from a functional perspective because I'm a physical therapist, but adding in the piece of pleasure. And to be clear, pleasure begins with sensual pleasure. If you ask somebody what pleasure is about, they kind of get sheepish and they kind of look back because the word pleasure has been hijacked as sexual pleasure. And
Mhm.
people, when you say, what do you do for pleasure? They're like, I don't, what do you mean? Because you don't understand. Sexual pleasure is really appreciating things from the five senses. We can all do it. It never expires. It never runs out. You have it everywhere. But the thing is you have to reach out and take it. We're so busy in our lives, running, racing, doing, and going, that we often don't take time to just walk outside and look up in the sky and say, oh my gosh, isn't that a beautiful sky? Or the breeze feels so good. This is so wonderful. Because every time we do that, or we touch, somebody touches us, your partner touches you, or you touch someone that's their skin is so soft, you see a baby, you hear a baby giggle, all of that raises our endorphins. All of that makes us happier, just on a very basic level. When there's pain, whether it's with vulvodynia or whether it's postpartum or whether it's with menopause, pre or post menopause, it's a downer. And it brings us down and it decreases those endorphins that make us happy. So something just as simple as making a pleasure diary. Elizabeth talks about making a pleasure diary and keeping track of a different sense every day and things that you can do to heighten that sense of pleasure. It's very easy to do. And once you start doing it and you realize that it really does kind of make you feel better, you have a desire to do it more. My thing right now is that I really feel that when it comes to sexual pleasure, that sensual pleasure is the groundwork for desire. Because if we're having sex, if women are having sex and they don't like it or it does not bring them pleasure, why are they going to want to do it? Why are they going to have desire to do it more and more? So we know from the literature that that increase in endorphins, that feel good, that pleasure can help tamp down pain. So that's just in a general basis, are women with chronic pain anywhere in their body. It doesn't matter what it's from, what your diagnosis is, or how it happened, that by trying to bring yourself out of that sludge of chronic pain and recognize things that are good or right can really make you feel better.
So there are two sides of the same coin. And I love that you prescribe pleasure as a tool for healing sexual pain. I also love the way that you expand the concept of pleasure to incorporate the senses. I am such a huge advocate of that. And I find that, yeah, in my own experiences, I was navigating menopause and, experiencing low desire. It was turning to the senses, turning to nature, turning to touch, that first cup of tea in the morning, really noticing, bringing that mindful awareness. I had a conversation with Dr. Lori Brotto, who uses mindfulness practices to address low desire. And it's really about bringing awareness to those things that give us pleasure so that we can amplify, create new pleasure pathways that can, like, as you say, damp down that pain we experience. Because I think it's so easy for us to go to pain, right? I taught yoga for so many years, and so many women tell me when I guide them to go internally into the body with their thoughts or their breath, they go straight to pain or discomfort. And that's part of the human condition, right? To go
Sure.
there. There's not enough discussion or talk about going towards pleasure, but it's always there,
Right.
isn't it? It's always there to access.
It's always there. You can find it anywhere. You don't have to go out. You don't have to buy it. It doesn't cost anything. And it's there again, but you just have to take advantage of it and use that mindfulness process and bring it into your life. The problem in our medical world, and problem, I don't really think it's their fault that they think that they can treat things with medication. Well, let's just give you a pill. We'll try to give you a pill for that desire. We'll try to give you a pill for that arousal. And I think it worked a little bit better on men than it did on women. But in case you don't know, there's a lot of difference between men and women. So we have to find other ways as women to get there and to be able to build that however we can get there. And the sensuality during the course of every day and with your partner. We know that the number one risk factor on sexual dysfunction in partnered couples who are sexually active is the relationship. And if you don't have a good relationship, chances are you're not going to have good intimacy. It's just kind of the way it is. So it's important to like who you're with and talk to them and touch them and see them and taste them and all of those kinds of things.
You give, as I mentioned, over 22 pleasure prescriptions in the book, and they all apply to different conditions, different experiences that women are going through in their sexual healing. Besides the sensory awareness, that's a good starting point. Can you share with us another pleasure prescription that you find has been very helpful in your work with women?
Sure. Let me just go back just a second, if I could. The book itself, really, the first 2/3 of the book are specifically for the reader. She can share it if she wants to, but she doesn't have to. She doesn't have to have a gym membership. She doesn't have to own tennis shoes. It's where she really learns. Now, because we focused it on pain, the first chapter's on anatomy, the second is on pain. But then that sensuality comes in the third chapter, and that's all that we've just been talking about. Then that fourth chapter is on how to find your sexuality. And that's where we really have women literally take a look at their vulvas, because it's amazing how many women haven't. It's really important for them to understand how beautiful every single vulva is, and that every vulva, not like your hands, your eyes, your ears, your feet, every labia minora, that inside little lip, is different. Not only different person to person, it's different right from left. So to look at it, to feel it, to love it, to fall in love with it, to see what it feels like when you touch it, and go from there and have a sense of knowing what's actually there. And from that, we go on to how to touch and how to cup over your mons, just to get into where the clitoral nerves run right down over the top of that, to kind of key in and get a sense of what's happening there. We talk about, using your pelvic floor exercises and contractions, because those are involved with arousal and orgasm. Once we begin to get aroused, our pelvic floor muscles start reflexively to contract and relax. And so it's all just that. And then the next 3 chapters are on your family, what it was like, your body, and how it can impact what's happening. And then on how to really knock sex out of the park, putting it all together. Then if you decide you want to take that to a partner, the last 3 chapters on communication, touch, and consent. So we really built it that way so women could do it without a partner, without, again, having anybody else involved, whether they wanted them involved or not. And then the whole last part is taking it and sharing it.
I so appreciate how you start with this education piece, getting women to know their anatomy, and then to actually get to know their pleasure anatomy, literally to take pleasure into their own hands and explore, self-explore, and get women to start befriending their vulvas. There was an interesting case study by a woman, and you use the term genital self-esteem. I had never heard it phrased this way. I often attach the word shame or self-judgment or grief over changes our genitals experience, especially as we age. One of the clients in one of my group coaching courses expressed one time so much grief over her genitals at 50 not looking like they did at 20. And I love that you start with these very gentle practices of befriending our vulvas. Can you talk about this term genital self-esteem a little bit more?
Genital self-esteem is in the literature, and that's basically where it comes from, because there have been any number of studies looking at genital self-image. And I think that it really is just how you feel. It's a number of questions, and I can't remember how many questions are on the questionnaire, but it really helps us realize from a psychological perspective what you're thinking about your own anatomy. I think that this, and I'm not exactly sure, I'm not sure of the background or why this specifically was created within the realm of literature, but we know that labiaplasty, if you're not familiar, are you familiar with labiaplasty?
I've heard some horror stories about labiaplasty.
Labiaplasty in the past, and I don't know if it's still the case, was the fastest growing elective surgery in the world. And what labiaplasty is going in and removing some portion of the inner lips, of the labia minora. Oftentimes, it also includes getting rid of the clitoral hood or cutting back on the clitoral hood. And it typically is, again, it's an elective procedure. Now, that being said, if there's cancer, if there's any disease, those kinds of things are essential and necessary, medically necessary. This labiaplasty is something that women do because they say they don't like the way their vulva looks, or they have pain. There's another big group of women who have very large labia minora and they have pain. That's a bit of a different story, but it's really incredible because, and I want to say this is in the genital self-esteem, I can't remember if it was there somewhere else, that women are, or partners are asked if it's the men, their partners, who don't like the way the labia look, or if it's actually the labia owners who don't like the way the labia look. And traditionally, the guys are the partners, males, females, whatever. I really don't care what she looks like. I love her. I like her. I like having intimacy with her. So it doesn't bother me at all. Traditionally, it's more a personal decision to do this. Quite frankly, the most popular labiaplasty is the Barbie doll.
Mm.
Barbie is where they totally remove the labia minora so that you can't see it. Now that may be okay. I mean, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do about anything. So that's not an issue for me. But again, you're talking about the woman who doesn't like the way her vulva looks at 50. There are a lot of changes that happen from a physiological, as well as a chemical response in our bodies as we age. And one of those, I mean, our uteruses start out the size of a newborn. I mean, when we're a newborn, we have a uterus. It gets bigger as we come into menarche, and then we're in the reproductive years. Once we hit menopause, it goes back down to the size of what it was when we were first born. So everything in the reproductive system changes with the loss of estrogen. What is the impact of these labiaplasties going to be when these young girls, and we've seen cases of it as young as somebody as young as 9 in the UK had a labiaplasty. What is their life progression going to be as estrogen levels change? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that anybody's has done any studies to look at that yet. But that's really what concerns me more than anything, is the scar tissue and the changes throughout the life cycle.
Yeah. And I know as women, we are the worst critics of our own bodies. And I hear this story over and over. Like, my partner says they love my body and they look at my vulva and they're just, mesmerized. I can't stand to look at myself. And I know that in the book, you focus a lot on the clitoral arousal network and how important it is to take our time getting to know our sexual anatomy. And that it's when we take that time and allow blood flow to the area that the whole area just blossoms open like a beautiful flower. And I think that's what we're not doing. We're not taking the time to allow ourselves to see the awe and wonder of this beautiful part of our bodies.
Right. And in my talks, and again, I've just come from doing a number of talks on From Pain to Pleasure in Australia. And it's really interesting because typically it's women's health physios and it's all women in the audience. And so, I'm sure that most of you have had instances of quickie sex. Let's just have a quickie, and what that feels like compared to a fully aroused sexual experience. And the issue is that the clitoris is only there for pleasure. Well, I'm here to tell you that a quickie, when you don't include your clitoris, is very different than what you just described as a fully aroused, fully engorged, fully open vaginal canal, waiting, that you've got increased temperature, you have increased blood flow, you have increased mucus production, you have tenting at the top of the vagina. You are so welcome to get anything, whatever that may be, in there to
Mm.
keep that arousal cycle. And this even comes if women are self-pleasuring. In this day and age, you can take a vibrator, you can put it on top of your mons, right above where the clitoris is. This is just a little model. this is the bone of the pelvis, and the clitoris sits, oh, this was so bad. The clitoris sits right on top of there. So if you can just come in, just start here, with a vibrator, clitoral nerves are right on top of the clitoris. You can have an orgasm like that fast, but it's not a fully aroused orgasm. If you
Mhm.
figure out and find out all the areas that are wonderful and nice, and you really get fully aroused. We don't have any studies yet looking at the pelvic floor muscle activity in fully aroused sex, be able to compare it to quickie sex, but that hopefully is something we're going to be working on soon.
Yes, please, please do that. I would love to hear more of that. Yeah, we had earlier in the series of podcast conversations here an interview with Sherry Winston, who wrote The Women's Anatomy of Arousal. And she explained all of that clitoral network and the importance of it getting fully, fully aroused and engorged, and how much time it really takes to do that. And in your book, you give over 22 prescriptions of how women can start to build that arousal in their day. You give solo practices, which are beautiful, and we've been talking about. You also give practices to do with a partner. I love the idea of inviting our partners in this exploration of building arousal. Sometimes our partners, especially men, I have to say, aren't aware this. They also don't have this education,
No,
right? They're only copying what's been seen in the movies and
right,
porn. And so they don't have this knowledge.
no.
How do you recommend inviting our partners in this exploration?
It really is about getting to know each other. Like I said, communication and relationship are key, but getting to know each other's body. There's a sensate focus. If you've not talked with anybody, have you talked with anyone about sensate focus?
Lori Brotto talked about sensate focus. Yes. But you can remind us what that is, please.
Well, it really is just a 3 or 4 step technique that allows us to do things to give each other pleasure that aren't sexual before then we progress to parts of our body that are more sexual, and then finally to that final intimacy, that act of intercourse. But it allows that same kind of thing that we're just talking about with sensuality, that you look at each other, you find out you may be somebody who really likes to have your head scratched right back here, and your
Mhm.
partner may be somebody who really doesn't like that at all, but would really just want, just if it's a male partner, just wants to go straight to it. And you know the blueprints who I'm talking about. So it brings them onto a common platform to say, no, I need to know essentially what feels good to you so that I can integrate this into our lives so that we can do things that make each other feel good. Then when we get into bed, we can take it on to the sexuality. That's one of the biggest things. Elizabeth talks about the AB game, where we're talking about each other and figuring out what each other wants. The 5 love languages is another really important piece that people can do to see. It's a very old book. I don't even know when it was published, but it talks about how we communicate. And if we don't talk the same love language, we don't communicate. So there are a lot of interpersonal things that go on with good, happy sex. Now, that being said, it's like, yeah, no, that's just not true at all, because there are a lot of people who have very good sex just on a natural basis and they don't have to do any of this. And I totally get it. Thank heavens and hooray. But for those who have issues, that's really who this is all about.
But I think even if you don't have issues, why wouldn't you just want to explore deeper? It's again exploring these new pathways to pleasure, creating those new neural pathways. It just opens more possibilities, right? And it just adds more variety and novelty into the game.
Right. I believe me, I totally hear you, but I've done, enough speaking to know that there's gonna be somebody who's gonna say, "I have great sex with my partner, and I don't have to do any of that." And I say, "That's fine. That's good." And your point, you maybe could make it a little bit better.
Mm.
ABC or not.
Mm.
And, I raised 5 kids. I have 9 grandbabies. I really don't like telling anybody what to do. Still
Mhm.
day, and even just a therapist. I said, "You can try this, you can do it. I'm not gonna tell you you have to do it because that's not my way, but use whatever works." And if you're having great sex and you don't know about all this other stuff, you try it and it doesn't work, okay. Don't make yourself crazy. But if you are having problems, I think there's a lot of help out there, and that's really the bottom line.
The Pleasure Prescription, over 22 of them in this book. Thank you so much for writing this book with your co-author, Elizabeth Wood. It truly is a gift, especially if you're navigating that terrain of sexual pain. Pleasure is the antidote for that. I so love that perspective. We're nearing the end of our conversation, and something that I always ask my guests is, what does pleasure mean to you?
We've talked a lot about it. From my perspective, pleasure is the opposite of pain and hurt. We can feel physical pain, and we certainly can feel emotional hurt. So pleasure, on the other hand, is like this incredible, magnificent psychological and physiological high where everything feels good, inside and out and all over. But again, we have to bring it there, and we have to let ourselves experience it. We can all have it. It's not hard, and it doesn't have to do with sex. It's an everyday activity to make us feel better, to bring those endorphins up.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Dee. I would love to let our listener know where they can find you, your beautiful body of work. I know you have several projects going on at the moment, so please share with us.
Elizabeth and I have a website, pleasuremovement.com, which is where we have a lot of information listed. We also have vulvalove.com, which is a lot about education on labiaplasty and vulvar diversity. And my website is Dee Hartmann. Physicaltherapy.net is my own personal website. The book is listed on, you can see it on Pleasure Movement, but you can get it on Amazon as well.
Yeah, that's where I got my copy. And I'll make sure to include all those links of all those amazing resources. I went down a rabbit hole researching you and looking at all the wonderful projects and information and education and free resources that you offer. I know you have a retreat coming up. Is that right? And later in the year?
For the fall, if my schedule has kind of changed because I'm traveling and I had to add on somewhere else to go with that. So I'm not really sure what the date or what it's going to be, but it is currently on the website, but we're going to have to just play it by ear and see what happens. So.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dee, for saying yes to pleasure and joining me in this conversation today. It's been very illuminating, and I know our listeners are going to learn so much from you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you too. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Pleasure in the Pause. Want to help me spread more pleasure in the world? Hit the share episode button and send it to a friend, or post it on your Instagram stories and tag me, Gabriella Espinosa. And if you really love this podcast, please leave a rating or review, as this helps the show get in front of new listeners. Finally, if you would like to access even more pleasure and stay in touch, sign up for my free pleasure upgrade bundle of powerful mind-body practices by going to pleasureinthepause.com. Remember, your pleasure matters.